I'm also really glad that we get to have Gregory Wolfe here this evening as our keynote speaker. Mr. Wolfe is from Image Journal and Seattle Pacific University. In 1989, he founded Image, which really has become one of America's top literary quarterlies. I myself first ran into Image in the 90s when I was at the University of St. Thomas. And despite the fact that my wife, Jen, was working assembling furniture in what was then Dayton's, and I was a full-time graduate student and part-time short-order cook, I did get a subscription. It's that good. Image is a unique forum for the best of writing and artwork that is informed by or grapples with religious faith. Materials that were first published in Image have appeared in Harper's, Utne Reader, the Wilson Quarterly, as well as the Pushcart Prize Anthology, Best American Essays, Best American Poetry, and other prominent publications. And since 2000, Mr. Wolfe has served as a writer in residence at Seattle Pacific University, where he teaches English literature and creative writing. He's also the founder and director of their Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And he's published over 200 essays, reviews, and articles in numerous journals, including the Wall Street Journal, Commonweal, and First Things. His essays have been anthologized in collections such as The Best Christian Writing and The Best Catholic Writing. He's also published many books, including one I strongly recommend called Beauty Will Save the World, Recovering the Human in an Ideological Age, as well as Intruding Upon the Timeless, Meditations on Art, Faith, and Mystery, and a biography on Malcolm Muggeridge. Mr. Wolfe is currently researching a book about the Renaissance Christian humanists who gathered around the great scholar and writer Desiderius Erasmus. The working title of that book is In the Company of Good Letters. So I will let Mr. Wolfe maybe say more about that. And because one of the foundational principles of Trinity School is to educate children in a true and integral Christian humanism, that's one of the reasons we're so excited to have Mr. Wolfe here with us this evening. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Gregory Wolfe.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate it. I was here just 1 week ago, so this is a case of deja vu all over again. Although it was snowing last week. So I'll take this. I'm very grateful to John Balsbaugh for the invitation and for the opportunity to get to know him a little bit better over this last couple weeks and to get some firsthand sense of what's going on here at Trinity School. I actually met the founder of the Trinity School group, system, empire, I don't know what the right word is, Carrie Kohler, many years ago, probably around 1980, probably about the mid-'80s, I would say. I was a whippersnapper. I was just a wet behind the ears kid, but I saw this very dynamic but very gentle soul, Carrie Kohler, and I had a really good feeling about him and his vision. And I thought it had a good chance to flourish and to help young people flourish. And here we are. So, testimony to his vision and to my prescience in sensing the wisdom of this. Now, I want to talk tonight about a rather oddball pairing of words, a pairing of words that while John may have made it sound like it's the easiest thing and the most natural thing to slip off the tongue, frankly, for the last half century or so, these two words have not been used to modify each other, Christian humanism. Now, when people use the word humanism these days, they mostly think of it as, by definition, secular humanism. And so the word humanism is usually modified in common parlance by that word secular. But I've done the research, and I've discovered that this has been about only 50 years since this has been the case. It was actually first mentioned in a Supreme Court case. Interesting that it come up in such a legalistic area, sort of defining zones of belief. I want to try to prove to you tonight that these two words belong together. And I hope they do. I know that what I think is a beautiful paradox, full of meaning, some people just think is oxymoron. You know what oxymorons are? Phrases like government organization, alone together, same difference, recorded live, plastic glasses, tight slacks, Peace Force, pretty ugly, work party, jumbo shrimp, and my favorite of all, headbutt. You know, many years ago when I had to come up with the name of the legal entity that publishes Image Journal, because you always have to have a 501c3 nonprofit with a kind of bland, generic name. It's part of the rules of how you do these nonprofits. And I came up with the phrase, the Center for Religious Humanism. I had people just click their tongues and go, oh dear Lord. You couldn't have thought of the worst phrase to use. You use that word humanism, and it's going to get you in all kinds of trouble. And frankly, I've had to do a lot of explaining over the years. But you know, times change. And I have a feeling that the present moment is maybe a little bit more open to this. Maybe after 50 years of using the word humanism in a context utterly different from its origin, we're beginning to wake up to that fact and recover its original meaning. I want to tell you a little bit about why this phrase means so much to me by telling you just a sort of abbreviated version of my life story. I went to college at a place that I think a number of your graduates have gone and are likely to go in the future, Hillsdale College in Michigan. Hillsdale, as you know, is known as a bastion of traditional values, with a very thoroughly integrated curriculum. And I went there pretty clueless. My dad said I should go. It was either that or Boston University. I mean, I didn't know. I just figured my dad had strong feelings about it and like, whatevs, you know, sure. But I caught the intellectual dynamism of the place immediately, and I was hooked almost instantly. Now, Hillsdale is a place that, while traditional, is also in some ways very modern. It's interested in politics and political battles. So it's sort of caught between teaching the tradition and taking sides on contemporary issues. And I would be the last person to criticize that. I don't think we have the luxury of living in the ivory tower. We have to be participants in the culture in our own time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I believe that's important in a slightly different context. But what it did for me was cause a little bit of a kind of meltdown. I knew that I cared for my faith, and I cared for art and beauty and literature, and I cared for political engagement, or let's call it civic engagement with the world around me. And so at Hillsdale, the first model that came to my attention was what I would call the culture wars model. And if you're young, war is a beautiful thing. I know it's ironic, but the young love war in a way that folks who are a little older figure out isn't quite as cool. But when you're young, you are on fire for justice. You're on fire for righteousness, truth, the American way, and apple pie. And I was too. In fact, if the story didn't go the way it's about to go, as I'm about to tell you, I would probably be on Fox News wearing a bow tie, shouting in a very loud voice at somebody else. But I had this other side of me, this side that, yes, I loved argumentation and polemics, but I also loved art and beauty. And so I was ineluctably attracted to my English major. But I was still trying to make all these things fit together. So somebody told me that I should read the writing of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, I was told. T.S. Eliot wrote wonderful defenses of traditional Christian values in the modern world of Bloomsburyite London. In fact, when he would publish something, it would give Virginia Woolf a migraine for a week. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to give trendy liberal writers migraines. That was my way of warfare, a la the literary life. So I read these essays by Eliot, and I admired them, and I thought they were brilliant in the way that they dissected problems in the modern framework. But eventually I had to go on to read his poetry. After I read the essays, I had to read the poetry because he was known as a poet. That's how he got to write the articles and the essays. But it was a difficult experience for me to read the poetry because here I was, trained as a culture warrior, trained to believe that the modern world was a really terrible place. In fact, we used to love to talk about modernity, right? Modernity was bad. The past was good, modernity was bad. So I began reading the poetry of T.S. Eliot, and I went, wait, this is modern art, right? Because we also used to say that. We would say modern art with capital letters, and you would hear the capital, it would be like, modern art. So I was having this sort of meltdown experience. I was sort of having what they call a cognitive dissonance. Because here was this guy, T.S. Eliot. He was using stuff like fragmentation, allusions to other historical works that I hadn't read or heard of before. And there was like sex and alienation and sex and sex. Did I say sex? And all this stuff was like, whoa, weird, bad, discombobulation. What's going on? Luckily, I had a couple professors who were deeply influenced by Eliot and knew how to take me through his writings and help me see things that I hadn't seen. For example, among other things, they said, see those fragments that you think are all about the brokenness of the modern world and anarchy and despair? They said, look at those fragments for a minute. Guess what? A fragment is like a piece of a puzzle, right? A fragment's a broken off bit. Did you ever think what the other missing piece might be that's supposed to fit in to that missing bit that Eliot gives you? No. Well, think about it for a moment. Say the phrase in Ash Wednesday, and after this our exile. Oh, that's kind of sad, really. Exile, modern alienation, feeling outside, not feeling integrated, not feeling part of a community. Right, obviously. Except that's an excerpt that goes on to say, and after this our exile, show us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Oops. Whoa. I get it now. A fragment of what we've lost points us towards the wholeness that we long for. Eliot, in some ways, is acknowledging the brokenness of a world riven by World War I, by modern philosophy, yes, by modernity to some extent. But when I saw that Eliot was able to sort of use modernity against modernity, or to work in and through the formal properties of modernism in art to indicate a deeper and truer way. Mind blown. Then somebody said, have you read Flannery O'Connor? Well, I remember reading A Good Man Is Hard to Find, and I'm like, ooh. Yeah, okay. Violence and the grotesque. Violence and the grotesque. And somebody pointed out, well, she was reading all these existentialist writers, and Nathaniel West, Miss Lonely Hearts, and Camus, and all these guys. But I'm like, well, it's pretty violent. Isn't this like sinners in the hand of an angry God? Somebody said to me, what is the source of the violence in Flannery O'Connor? Is it an angry God, in fact? Or is it possibly the human pride of people who are so in denial about the way reality is that they feel like they can get in their cars and drive 100 miles an hour straight toward a brick wall and mysteriously go through it? Except that when they hit that wall, out of their own will, their own desire, their own ego, and get knocked on their ass, who is the source of the violence? It's not the wall's fault. It's human pride. And by the way, did you notice that when they get knocked on their ass, and you remember from the old Looney Tunes, right? You get the little stars that go around and the Tweety birds. When you're on your ass, you can sort of look up and go, oh, hi. Right? It's a moment of grace. It's a moment of openness, potentially of conversion. So here were these two great writers, very modern, very contemporary, working in styles that secular humanists were using. And yet they were deeply traditional in their vision. And I just had to figure it out. I had somehow to make sense of this. And it finally dawned on me that the nature of artistic form has to change over time because of a little thing called history, different cultural circumstances, the ebb and flow of the factors that shape each culture. And that it's precisely the way of the West, maybe as opposed to the more unchanging East, which loves the eternal. I was talking to an iconographer earlier this evening about that. But in the West, it's all been about changing the form in order to preserve the spirit, right? I mean, if you ever really hate the idea of change in art, here's a little thought experiment, okay? Imagine yourself, you're in a group of Romanesque architects, okay? You and your Romanesque architects, you've based your whole art on the rounded arch, on the beautiful Roman rounded arch, which bears weight so beautifully, which is a semicircle, which alludes to the circle, which is about eternity and beauty. And your churches, because they can't bear too much weight, can't have a lot of glass in them, so they're dark, and darkness is about mystery. And then you walk into the first Gothic church and go, what the is going on here, right? Who are these whippersnappers with their little pointy arches and all their big light-bearing windows? Who do they think they are, right? That's the nature of the debates that we have over artistic change and artistic style. I use Romanesque and Gothic because they're like both medieval, so they're like both great, but I'm sure there were some pretty pissed off Romanesque architects. I honestly believe that. Once I started recognizing that was kind of the rhythm, the nature of artistic change, of development over time, it helped me see a lot of other things. For one thing, it made me suspicious of what I call the decline and fall argument, the notion that everything's getting worse. Oh, this is so tempting. Let me tell you, Hillsdale, they loved it back in those days. I hope they're a bit beyond that now, but I call this declinism. It's all going downhill. I mean, it feels so good to feel so bad. Declinism is great because it fuels our anger, it fuels our self-righteousness, it fuels our rage. you know. The only trouble is I ask people, like, could you map Western Civ for me? Like, is it all uphill to 1300 and then like just like up and down? Or like, are there any squiggles? And like, was civil rights kind of good thing to get? Was that like a little uptick maybe? Or women getting the vote or something? You know, there are people who are like, I've said a bad word, right? My argument is that things are going up and going down pretty regularly. The other thing I realized about faith was that faith has to be embodied in culture. It can't live in abstraction. You can't bottle faith and keep it separate from the muck and the mire of everyday life, of culture. Just look at the beginnings of the Gospels of Matthew and John. Matthew, with his genealogies, is already enculturating the gospel towards his Jewish audience, who are going to want to know about the bloodlines, right? Gospel of John begins, in the beginning was the Logos, a Greek philosophical context. We don't even get past the Gospels before the gospel is enculturated, incarnate, in stuff, in language, in words that have histories. So when I came to that recognition, it was liberating. It enabled me to sense the possibility that great art can happen at any time, anywhere. Great art that grapples with faith, like Jacob wrestling with the angel. And that great art is fundamentally, precisely about the way that spirit inheres in flesh. We talk about form and content, right? Form and content, body and soul. These things are one. You cannot separate them. If you separate them, you destroy each one. Each one becomes distorted. Christianity is an incarnational faith. If the Spirit doesn't live in flesh, it becomes abstract, legalistic, dry, unmoving. Only if faith is embodied in the stuff that we make. Somebody wants to define culture itself as what people make of the world. What we make. When we make of the world, we have to make according to the culture of the time we live in, the way Eliot and O'Connor were making things out of the culture in which they lived. For us, it's kind of postmodern consumerist weirdness. You know, that's what we're given. That's our materials, in a sense, that we're working with. And you can try to paint like Michelangelo or even write like T.S. Eliot right now, but you know what? Though it might be kind of a cool trick, it's not going to move anyone. Because there's no organic relationship between the world now and the world of this faux Michelangelo that you're imitating. People understand that intuitively, but once they start arguing about it, they tend to forget those distinctions. So I began to wonder whether the culture wars were themselves problematic. Do war and culture really go together very well? I don't think so. To me, culture is about cultivating, right? It's about tilling the ground, making it fertile, fertilizing it, watering, sowing a seed. I began to feel that the culture wars eventually were like two enemy camps spraying poison on each other's ground so that nothing would end up growing there. All we would have left were people screaming about the death of culture. Duh. Nietzsche himself, not exactly a Christian humanist according to the normal definition, Nietzsche said, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And that's exactly what I began to feel about the culture warriors around whom I lived. Eventually, I found in history a kind of distant mirror, to quote the great title of a work of history by Barbara Tuchman, in a period called the Renaissance. Some of you may have heard of it. In these same circles that I grew up in, the Renaissance was given a bad name, precisely because the Renaissance was being excoriated as the origin of secular humanism. I was told that the Renaissance was about man and man being better than God, etc., etc. You know, the funny thing about that historical myth, and frankly it is a myth, is that it was created by a 19th century German secular liberal, Jakob Burckhardt. And most of the 20th century Renaissance historiography took a whole century to kind of completely tear it down and debunk it. The notion that there's a tremendous difference between the medieval and the Renaissance era in terms of Christianity, there is none. Many of the most powerful humanists of the Renaissance era were people of faith. But for me, this era of the great Christian humanists of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, particularly the gang, Erasmus, Thomas More, Hans Holbein the Younger, and some of the more obscure figures working in that era, they became my heroes. They began to explain to me what it was that I was stumbling towards in all of this journey of mine. Because what they believed in, above all, was that the rediscovery of classical literature, yes, pagan literature, was that by intersecting, by interacting with, by synthesizing Christian faith with the greatest that human beings had ever written, that faith could become incarnate again and embodied. The guys who were writing in the humanistic period in the Renaissance were fighting against Christianity that had become reduced to rote scholastic, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, where it was all about, again, propositions, concepts, abstractions, ideas. But Christianity was seeming to be more and more distant from life, from the messy, concrete experience of every day. And these Christian humanists like Erasmus and More were saying, no, literature is the force that forces us to take the big ideas and to test them in real human circumstances in order to tell a great story, a story that wants to embody faith, wants to embody the great philosophical things. It has to work on a human level. It has to be persuasive. It has to be convincing. It has to be palpable. And without that, it's going to stay abstract. It's not going to move the heart. And so the humanists were huge fans of rhetoric. They loved Cicero and rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is a word that this school probably reveres. I hope it does. Tell me it does, John. Yes. But you know that in the mainstream culture, rhetoric means what? It means the opposite of what it should mean. It means manipulative demagoguery, right? But to Cicero and to the Renaissance humanists, rhetoric was the way that human language fit the need of the moment to the circumstances of the moment. Rhetoric builds bridges between people. Rhetoric connects people by appealing to their hearts, by giving them concrete stories that they can relate to. Now, for those of you who think, because I've quoted a couple Catholic thinkers, and I know that this is a beautifully ecumenical community, I should say that the notion that humanism was a Catholic thing is also mistaken. Many of the early reformers were thoroughly humanistic. In fact, Luther's hero was Erasmus. And Luther was pretty much like, hey, Erasmus, you're my hero, come on to my side. And Erasmus, being the kind of guy that he was like, slow down, Martin, take it easy, let's not get too hot-headed, let's use rhetoric to connect people. And Martin Luther was like, are you kidding me? There's no time for that. And eventually they had to clash, but Erasmus was kind of a broken man after that. All of the early reformed educational programs both in terms of Calvinism and Lutheranism. They all read classic pagan literature. The notion that like the reformers rejected pagans because they were pagans, completely false. Why? Because their Christian discernment was enough for them to be able to draw what was good. Test everything, St. Paul said. Retain what is good, right? So that was a unifying theme. And in that era, the humanists said literature embodies these complex abstractions that without embodiment run rampant over the countryside. Thomas More was the same way. I know that you guys study A Man for All Seasons in this school, and one interesting thought experiment, if anyone's interested in doing it, would be to compare A Man for All Seasons by Robert Bolt, which is a fascinating play and film written by a guy who was not officially religious at all. In fact, I think he called himself an atheist and was at one point a card-carrying communist, but who was deep, close friends to two Dominican brothers and was fascinated by Christian humanism. Robert Bolt, on the one hand, put that alongside our current masterpiece theater. Have you heard about this? Wolfe Hall, based on the Hilary Mantel novel, or two novels, Wolfe Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. Wow, totally different. That shows a lot of difference. Maybe there is decline and fall after all. Because this is in the new Wolfe Hall, which is telling the same story of the Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn and Queen Catherine of Aragon, and heads are rolling, and you know all the drill, right? It's told from the story of the arch nemesis of Robert Bolt's play, Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell, who many historians think of as kind of a Machiavellian thug, is turned by Hilary Mantel into a kind of wise, moderate figure. Pragmatic, yes, in the good British pragmatic way, not like that uptight, priggish, moralistic, effete, scholarly Thomas More. And if you watch this Wolfe Hall series, you'll see a night and day depiction of Thomas More, who in Robert Bolt's version is this man who combines deep piety with also a very worldly wise sense of how screwed up politics and the church are, and who is able to move back and forth between those. But in Mantel's view and the TV show's view, he's a prig. He's a bit of a stuck-up prig. And it's one interesting contrast of two different views of this great Renaissance humanist. By the way, for those who are interested, I know this is a slight digression, and I am heading toward the conclusion here. But did you all know that Robert Bolt also wrote the screenplay for The Mission? And that The Mission is also probably the second greatest depiction of Christian humanism on film in the 20th century? So, for those of you who don't know, The Mission's about the Jesuits going up into the inner reaches of South America. And at first they get ejected, let's say, forcefully, because they try to preach, they try to use abstraction, they try to use proposition, argument, a little bit of culture war. And then the difference happens, and this isn't a spoiler because it happens like in the first 5 minutes, is the Jesuit who climbs up the huge waterfall goes in and starts to play the oboe. And the Guarani people, who are deeply musical, they all come, and their spears are like with an inch of his face, right? Spears from every angle. And he's shaking a little bit, but he's playing the flute. Why? Art, beauty, humanity, something concrete, something that connects them. That opens the door. And then you find this incredible story of the way that these people do receive the gospel. And then they talk about choirs like the beautiful choir we had this evening. Guarani they were doing Renaissance polyphony, and it was gorgeous until politics, culture wars back in Europe screwed everything. So fascinating that a card-carrying communist lush named Robert Bolt will write these two screenplays. But he was close to these two Dominican brothers, the McCabe brothers, both brilliant Thomists, followers of Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, I just love this kind of digression, sorry. But Bolt got it. Bolt got it. For example, one of the beautiful things in the beginning of A Man for All Seasons is, if you listen very carefully in the first scene, because you can barely hear them talking in the background, but they're talking about, oh, there are, Father so-and-so, is he said to be a bastard, have a bastard son. And everyone's like, ha, 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 sexual abuse and blah, blah, blah. These are the humanists. They understand how screwed up the church is, right? And they're horrified by it, but they can make fun of it because they're opponents of it and they're trying to reform the church. So that is Bolt's way of saying, if you are tempted to think of Moore as stuck up and abstract in his faith, he's not. He knows just how messed up the world is, but he knows that you can't come in and just wipe out 1,000 years of history, as Henry VIII tried to do, and actually bring about real reform in people's lives. Okay. Here's the finish line. I got 2 4s for you, so you can count down 8 things now. Okay? So I always feel that having a countdown kind of helps. I want to share with you just a way of looking at Western cultural history that has helped me tremendously. And I'm recommending it to John. I think you could do a faculty seminar on this book. No pressure. But it's called 4 Cultures of the West by John W. O'Malley, who's a Jesuit historian at Georgetown University. And this book was really important for me because it not only helped me understand why Christian humanism means so much to me, but also how it fits in the larger picture of cultural and intellectual discourse. So it's not super complex. It's pretty straightforward. Let me just share it with you. So according to O'Malley, they're basically, while there are more than 4 cultures, there are 4 biggies that have been in dialogue with each other throughout Western history. Culture 1, the culture of the prophetic religious culture. Thou shalt not. The prophetic religious culture is powerful. It's intense. God speaks. It's about revelation. Culture 2, academia, the intellectual life. It's powerful too. It's marked by skepticism, by the kind of thinking that tries to find the logical flaws. It's always taking things apart using reason. So these are 2 powerful forces, you might say, religion and the intellectual life, core dialogue of our culture, right? Culture number 3 is the pivotal culture, according to O'Malley. It's the culture of rhetoric and literature. Why is it pivotal culture? Because of what I just said a few minutes ago. Because rhetoric is about making connections. It's about giving flesh to these big abstractions of religion and the intellectual life, which tend to float around and dominate the society in which they live, because without being enfleshed, without being put in the mess and the muck of real life, they become so dominant that they terrorize people. So literature and rhetoric connect people. And rhetoric in culture 4 is the culture of the performing and visual arts, even more physically embodied. But culture 3, the culture of language, literature, rhetoric, is pivotal. It's the one that kind of keeps the peace, that tries to build connections. It can't supplant, no culture can supplant the other. They're all needed. We need the prophetic, we need the intellectual, we need the literary, we need the performing arts. O'Malley says of this 3rd pivotal culture, the culture of humanism, in poetry, the reasons of the heart prevail in a form of discourse that is more circular than linear. If culture 2 seeks clear-cut definition, this culture, at least in this particular aspect, glories in ambiguity, in rich layers of meaning. So for me, what I love about this tradition of Christian humanism, which wasn't only in the Renaissance. You can look at people like Augustine, the way he was synthesizing Plato, or you can look at 20th century thinkers, People like Maritain and Gilson, who were taking Thomas Aquinas and synthesizing him with the modern world. And one could go on. Walker Percy synthesizing Kierkegaard. That desire to give flesh, to bring things together, to build bridges, to make connections, is essential to Christian humanism. So, that's how the four cultures work. And now, the four lessons of Christian humanism, okay? Trying to keep it straightforward here. The first key lesson, to my mind, of the Christian humanism is synthesis, or call it engagement, or call it assimilation. Christian humanism is always about dialogue with what's going on outside the front door, what's going on with the culture. The way that the author of the Gospel of John was dialoguing with Plato, the way that Augustine was dialoguing with Neoplatonism, the way that Eliot was dialoguing with modern symbolism and modernist poetry, the way Flannery O'Connor was dialoguing with existentialism and nihilism. There's this desire to connect, this desire to not simply retreat into a Christian subculture that cuts itself off from the mainstream of how human beings are living their lives, but to reach out and to feel and to connect with that, and to be challenged by that, to listen as well as to speak. That process, that belief that the faith can bring everything into it and purify it and send it back out into the world, not destroyed or changed beyond recognition, but purified, but chastened, but infused by a spiritual dimension, is part of what I think the faith has always done. Lesson 2. Christian humanism is always interested in the present. It always resists declinism. It understands, as Eliot understood, that tradition can only be preserved by the individual talent of the moment who adds to that tradition and enables us to stay close to that tradition by embodying it in their own tweak, change, tiny incremental addition to that tradition. That's what Eliot said. He says, when a new writer writes, we read Dante differently. Because that writer, Eliot's a perfect example. We read Dante now through Eliot. And I really believe that when Christians think that the world has declined so much that we can only preserve the best of the past as if under glass, we can only treat our cultural heritage as a museum, we're screwed. We're screwed. The faith is going to touch nobody, it's going to reach no one. It's essentially giving up the game. It's like the Holy Spirit is in a cage in somebody's basement somewhere. I kid you not, this is the kind of thing that I run across all the time. Maybe you've never experienced it. If not, God bless you. I run across it all the time, and it depresses me no end. It's easy, and it's easy to be self-righteous about that kind of declinism, but it's a cop-out. It's a retreat from reality, not an engagement with it. The Holy Spirit is present at all times and works through all ages, however screwed up you think the present time is. Third lesson. Creativity is more important than criticism. And this is a mistake that I think people of faith have made for decades, and which I think is beginning to change. This very event is an example of it. We have thought that it was once again better to resort to abstraction, talking heads, argumentation, fighting, war, debate. That doesn't do a lot. Yeah, it's important. Apologetics are important. They play a role. I would consider it a supporting role. Best supporting actress. It's the imagination. It's the artist who, I think, engages the heart and changes culture. You can argue all you want around the edges, but the great cultural innovations and changes come through the imagination and come through creativity, not through criticism. Finally, the fourth lesson, and you can tell that I've been kind of angling towards this the whole time, is peace is better than war. Peacemaking, reconciliation, building bridges. What's one of the Pope's nicknames? Pontifex, maker of bridges. If people of faith want to reach out to others, they need to build bridges. And the greatest bridge, in my opinion, is the bridge of the imagination, where we try to feel and live the experience of the other. I think that's what Jesus wanted us to do. I may have gotten that part wrong. So what I would like to believe is that rather than being angry or depressed about the decline and fall of things, that Christian humanists are people of hope. Doesn't necessarily mean they think everything's getting better and super great and land of tomorrow, but it means that they don't believe in some simplistic notion of decline and fall. The world's messy, things are going up and things are going down at the same time. Don't get hung up on that. I think Christian humanists have a kind of serenity, or put it this way, just a kind of wisdom about the world that's humble, alert, expectant, full of hope. To make this point and to close, thank you for your patience, I'm going to quote one of the greatest of all contemporary Christian humanists, Miss Annie Dillard. She writes, "There were no formerly heroic times, and there was no formerly pure generation. There is no one here but us chickens. And so it has always been. A people busy and powerful, knowledgeable, ambivalent, important, fearful, and self-aware. A people who scheme, promote, deceive, and conquer, who pray for their loved ones and long to flee misery and skip death. It is a weakening and discoloring idea that rustic people knew God personally once upon a time, or even knew selflessness or courage or literature, but that it is too late for us." Sorry, lost my place. In fact, the absolute is available to everyone in every age. There never was a more holy age than ours, and never a less. There is no less holiness at this time, as you are reading this, than there was the day the Red Sea parted. In any instant, the sacred may wipe you with its finger. In any instant, the bush may flare, your feet may rise, or you may see a bunch of souls in a tree. In any instant, you may avail yourself of the power to love your enemies, to accept failure, slander, or the grief of loss, or to endure torture. Purity's time is always now. Thank you very much.